Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
And greetings, friends, and welcome to this December 18th, 2013 edition of Nightcast. For our first story tonight, friends, let's go to the EU, or a story about the EU.
They're waiting and watching in Dover. This town is the first stop for many who come to Britain to make this country their new home.
This is BBC Radio Kent.
Downing Street's announced that restrictions to make new European Union migrants wait 3 months before they can apply for out-of-work benefits will come into force on the 1st of January.
That announcement was meant to reassure people that the hundreds of thousands of Poles who settled in Britain won't be followed by huge numbers from Romania or Bulgaria. Maya, who came here a decade ago, is sceptical.
3 months, I think, is too short a period, and I don't think that will put people off coming.
People's views of the past often shape their attitude to the future.
There's no jobs for the English people, let alone other people coming in trying to get our jobs.
They're hard working, and they'll find the jobs and go for it.
What difference will it make that EU migrants now have to wait 3 months before they can claim benefits here? How many will it affect? The government says it doesn't know. How much will it save? They cannot say. Skeptics say that's because it's all about politics.
We don't know if there's a problem. We know that if there is a problem, it's small, but the government hasn't published the figures which tell us whether it's very small or actually not there at all. So really, these just look like phantom policies to address a phantom problem.
What is certainly real is public anxiety about immigration, which is why the Prime Minister's taken to talking about it an awful lot.
So you found someone in here when you came in?
Today, immigration officers showed him the scene of a dawn raid on illegal immigrants. 14 people were crammed into this 3-bedroom West London house. But was today really just for the headlines and the cameras?
Well, I think the announcements today make a difference because there is a right to go and work and take a job in another European country, but there shouldn't be a right to go and just claim benefits. So we're putting that beyond doubt.
The Prime Minister says he's sending a signal by changing the benefit rules. It's pretty clear that the signal is meant for people here as much as people in Eastern Europe. But dozens of his own backbenchers say that that simply isn't enough. At question time, today's proposals were greeted with scepticism.
What he's proposing, which will probably be found illegal by the European courts, is really spitting in the wind when it comes to the problem that we face.
Today, The Sun joined the fray, calling on the government to get tougher and publishing a poll which suggests that if many more come here, the public would vote to get out of the EU. Music to the ears of UKIP.
If Mr Cameron wants to regain the trust of the British people, he's got to go to Brussels tomorrow and say, we will not end the transitional arrangements, we will not open the doors.
Will this Westminster row make much of a difference to who makes it to Dover in 2 weeks' time? Almost certainly not. For good or for ill, our borders are not about to be closed. Nick Robinson, BBC News.
And friends, that story, let's go to New Delhi next. I'm trying to figure out where my buttons are again tonight, friends. We've moved them, and I've done over 270 programs with the buttons in a certain order, and now we've changed them. It's supposed to actually work better this way. It does few things a little bit differently for me. But it sometimes throws me off just a little bit until I get used to it. But we'll get there. All right, next story. There's been talk about embarrassed. There's been an embarrassment for the United States, and there's been a demonstration that's occurred outside the United States Embassy in New Delhi.
Protests outside the U.S. Embassy in Delhi as a diplomatic row between India and the United States escalates. India has reacted strongly to the arrest of a female diplomat in New York with a series of retaliatory measures. Security barricades outside the American embassy have been removed, diplomatic privileges revoked for U.S. consular staff, and a visiting congressional delegation snubbed.
Afternoon, everyone.
The US has tried to play down the issue, but says it'll look into the matter.
Thus far, all indications are that appropriate procedures were followed. But nonetheless, and my statement pointed to this morning, we understand this is a very sensitive issue, and we're continuing to review exactly what transpired. And I would point out again that the State Department wasn't the only entity involved here. So I would point folks to the U.S. Marshals, who obviously play a role in this as well.
But India is furious over the treatment of their diplomat Devyani Khobragade after her arrest last week over allegations that she underpaid her Indian housekeeper. Ms. Khobragade was apparently publicly handcuffed, strip-searched in custody, and had DNA swabs taken before being kept in a cell. She has denied the allegations, and India says it'll do all it can to support her case. Sanjay Majumdar, BBC News, Delhi.
Okay, very sad story. However, I do have a compliment for the United States Secretary of State. I understand that he is concerned about this, and he has and is sending forth an apology. So I'm glad to hear that. And in fact, we got a story coming in right now. I'll try to have it ready for us later in the program. In our next story, friends, the United States Federal Reserve has announced a slowdown in its effort to boost the U.S. economy.
General Hayden, there are 46 points of recommendation now that the review board has come forward with. Let's treat them all in separate categories and start with the collection of phone call data from American citizens. What do they think should happen there?
Right.
My apologies if we got something out of order there. This next story relates to the NSA. And of course, you know, last week we had a story about how a federal judge handed down a ruling that a lot of the collection work, the intelligence work that the NSA has been doing is unconstitutional with the telephone records and all of that. And this story with BBC's Katty Kay and Mr. Hayden will cover more on that.
That's the 215 program from the section of the Patriot Act on which it's based. And I think most of your viewers know they've got it all. Those are all the phone records, to, from, when, how long, of all calls made in the United States or to and from the United States. What the Commission has recommended that this data, and it's about 1 trillion records, this data not be held by the government, but the data be held by a third party, either the phone companies themselves or some to-be-determined third party. It also recommends, and this is my reading of the recommendations, I think it's also suggesting that that data not be queried without the specific permission of the FISA court for that query. Now, that's quite different than what's going on right now, where the government holds the data and the government can query the data based upon a reasonable, articulable suspicion. The government did that 200 times last year. And now what the intelligence community has to tell the president is how much of an operational impediment will this new approach, I got to get the court's okay every time I do it, how much of an impediment that will create in intelligence analysis.
Okay, so concerning Americans, the data will still be collected, but there'll be restrictions on how it can be used. Let's look at foreign leaders, because of course around Europe, that is the issue that has caused so much controversy. Will the NSA carry on collecting the phone call records of foreign leaders?
Sometimes. And what the Commission recommends, and I think this is the only logical, possible, sustainable answer, is an American promise that this kind of activity will be reviewed at the highest levels of the United States government.
So it'll go to the White House?
It will go to the White House.
Himself?
I'm almost certainly the President will have final review authority. I actually think this will be conducted within the National Security Council staff, but the NSC works directly for the White House. And what they will do is they will go through, and the committee recommends a variety of criteria, and intelligence gain isn't the only one. There are a whole bunch of things, including something called due respect and deference for foreign leaders. And so I suspect, as a practical matter, we'll do this less often, but we'll still do it. And when we do it, it will be an American choice.
So will Angela Merkel be happy with these reviews if they're adopted?
I think she will. And she's already gotten personal assurances from the President. But you know, let's be very candid. The President said, we will not do this to you. The president can't say, we won't do this to any chancellor, or we won't do this to any German official. Now, that may be true. That may be our policy. But it would be very unwise for a president to feel as if he can predict the future so much that he can make that kind of commitment in perpetuity.
Okay, General Hayden, you've reviewed all the 46 recommendations. We don't know, of course, how many of them are actually going to be adopted. Do they address the concerns that you might have had about the program, if you had any concerns?
Well, I mean, first of all, I obviously was pretty comfortable with how they were being conducted. There was no evidence of abuse, but my old community is taking a bit of a public whipping here in the United States and somewhat globally, not so much for what they've done, let's take the 215 program, but the fact that it was so secret. And there are those folks who are saying you really didn't have consent of the governed because the governed really didn't know. Now, the folks in my old community are saying, oh, wait a minute, the Congress knew, the president knew, the courts knew. But we're in a new culture. We have shifting standards. So they're going to have to be more transparent. These recommendations recommend a whole series of steps that would increase transparency.
Will they make intelligence collection harder?
Yes, it will. And I freely admit that, and that is not an argument not to do some of these things. It may be an argument not to do a few of them, but it's not an argument not to do any. Making this more public will shave points off of operational effectiveness. But, Catty, my personal formula in this is if we don't do that, it won't matter because the American people won't let us do it in the first place.
Okay, General Michael Hayden, thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you.
Okay, that was former NSA Director Michael Hayden with the BBC's Catty K. Now, I have the video in the right order this time, friends. The chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Ben Bernanke, spoke today regarding the policy to slow down the buying of bonds. And we'll let him explain that.
The committee decided, starting next month, to modestly reduce the pace at which it is increasing the size of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. The committee also clarified its guidance on interest rates, emphasizing that the current near-zero range for the federal funds rate target likely will remain appropriate well past the time that the unemployment rate declines below 6.5%, especially if projected inflation continues to run below the committee's 2% longer-run goal. Today's policy actions reflect the committee's assessment that the economy is continuing to make progress, but that it also has much farther to travel before conditions can be judged normal. Notably, despite significant fiscal headwinds, the economy has been expanding at a moderate pace, and we expect that growth will pick up somewhat in coming quarters, helped by highly accommodative monetary policy and waning fiscal drag. The job market has continued to improve, with the unemployment rate having declined further. At the same time, the recovery clearly remains far from complete, with unemployment still elevated and with both underemployment and long-term unemployment still major concerns. We've also seen ongoing declines in labor force participation, which likely reflect not only longer-term influences such as the aging of the population, but also discouragement on the part of potential workers. Inflation has been running below the committee's longer-run objective of 2%. The committee recognizes that inflation persistently below its objective could pose risks to economic performance and is monitoring inflation developments carefully for evidence that inflation will move back toward its objective over time.
Okay, it's my belief that, friends, the only reason the United States has gone on through many things, including wars and what have you, is because, as Winston Churchill put it, or General MacArthur put it, there's a strong hand, unseen hand from someplace that intervenes on our behalf so many times. And not that it can be orchestrated and engineered by some who are expert in that type of thing. Next story. Russian President Vladimir Putin has agreed to buy $15 billion worth of Ukrainian government bonds and cut the price of at which Russia sells gas to the Ukraine. Emily Thomas has this report.
Hot food and roaring fires do little to soothe the bitter disappointment felt here in the heart of Kiev. There have been mass demonstrations since the government decided not to sign an association deal with the EU last month. President Yanukovych says that decision was influenced by pressure from Russia. Now he's made a deal with Moscow. The Russian president has offered the urgent financial assistance that Ukraine badly needed to keep its economy afloat. It faced an external funding gap of $15 to $17 billion next year. Now Mr. Putin has agreed to buy $15 billion worth of Ukrainian government bonds. He's also taken a third off the price of Russian gas, which Ukraine heavily relies on. But the leaders of the opposition and many Ukrainians are concerned about which strings could be attached to this deal. The two presidents say they didn't discuss Ukraine joining a Moscow-led customs union, but they did speak about a strategic partnership and sign agreements on economic cooperation, measures which appear to deepen Ukraine's ties with Moscow. The opposition is concerned.
I don't want to speculate, but it's obvious that such a big sum, plus the gas price reduction, could not have been given just like that. There probably were some agreements behind this, and I hope it was not against our national interests or our strategic assets.
The protesters in Independence Square share these fears.
In this bilateral deal, the government has transferred all the conditions from the Russian custom deal, or even worse ones. It means they have sold Ukraine out.
He did a very bad thing. He ignored the will of the people standing on this square. He didn't consult as a president should. The protesters here are despondent but resolute. They say they'll continue their protests until their demands are met for early elections. Emily Thomas, BBC News.
Friends, and I've got the video I mentioned to you was coming in. It's not totally new video. It'll repeat some of the same things in the video we showed earlier. But I'm very happy to learn the lead-in for this explains that U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry has called the director of the security in New Delhi and apologized for the United States failure to honor the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations under the 1961 Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, 1963. A council is afforded a variation of diplomatic immunity called consular immunity. It guarantees immunity from the host country's laws only with respect to acts related to consular duties. Earlier today, Mr. Kerry, again, he called the Indian National Security Advisor in an effort to ensure the incident would not hurt the two nations' close relationship. Even though this is going to repeat a little bit of what we saw earlier, friends, let's watch this video that explains Mr. Kerry's apology.
Protests outside the US Embassy in Delhi as a diplomatic row between India and the United States escalates. India has reacted strongly to the arrest of a female diplomat in New York with a series of retaliatory measures. Security barricades outside the American embassy have been removed, diplomatic privileges revoked for US consular staff, and a visiting congressional delegation snubbed.
Good afternoon, everyone.
The US has tried to play down the issue, but says it will look into the matter.
Thus far, all indications are that appropriate procedures were followed. But nonetheless, and my statement pointed to this morning, we understand this is a very sensitive issue, and we're continuing to review exactly what transpired. And I would point out again that the State Department wasn't the only entity involved here. So I would point folks to the U.S. Marshals, who obviously play a role in this as well.
But India is furious over the treatment of their diplomat Devyani Khobragade after her arrest last week over allegations that she underpaid her Indian housekeeper. Ms. Khobragade was apparently publicly handcuffed, strip-searched in custody, and had DNA swabs taken before being kept in a cell. She has denied the allegations, and India says it will do all it can to support her case. Sanjay Majumdar, BBC News, Delhi.
And friends, the United States Secretary of State John Kerry is in this next story. He's called for political differences in South Sudan to be resolved by practical, by practical and democratic means rather than violence.
I saw firsthand how devoted and dedicated the people of South Sudan were and are, and how they have endured many years of conflict and sacrificed far too much for their country to now go backwards and descend back into violence. Political differences need to be resolved by peaceful and democratic means, and those have been hard fought for. The government should respect the rule of law, and the people of South Sudan should be able to realize their full potential in peace.
Okay, friends, Mr. Kerry was in the Philippines speaking at a well, let me get my notes in front of me here. His comments come as UN diplomats in the country said they had been told by sources that hundreds of people are believed to have died in clashes between rival South Sudan army factions. Now, again, speaking on a visit to the Philippines, Mr. Kerry said that South Sudan's government should respect the rule of law. And this next video will explain the South Sudan fighting in 60 seconds.
South Sudan is facing the greatest challenge of its young life. Heavy fighting has continued in the capital Juba since Sunday night. These latest clashes have forced thousands to flee, and many more are hiding in their homes as the fighting rolls around Juba. South Sudan only became independent 2 years ago, after decades of civil war. The rebels who won independence were a pretty divided bunch, who often fought each other. Riek Machar broke away to form his own rebel movement in 1991. He later returned to the fold, even becoming vice president of the new country, but many of the South Sudanese elite do not trust him. President Salva Kiir sacked his deputy in July, and he now blames soldiers allied to Mr. Machar for starting this fighting. The president's critics say he's taking advantage of a military flare-up to deal with his enemies. One thing is clear: the long history of war has left South Sudan a militarized society with deep ethnic fractures.
And friends, this next story relates to something that happened last week. And China says one of its warships encountered a U.S. vessel, confirming U.S. reports of a near collision in the South China Seas earlier this month. The U.S. said its guided missile cruiser USS Cowpens was forced to take evasive action as the two ships neared one another on December 5. And this is the area where this occurred. It's been described as the most serious Sino-U.S. confrontation in the South China Sea since 2009. However, China said the incident was handled with quote-unquote strict protocol. The U.S. has said its ship was operating in international waters, but China claims part of the South China Sea, as you can see in this map. And a state-run newspaper quoted an expert, excuse me, friends, quoted a state-run newspaper quoted an expert as saying that the U.S. boat had been harassing China's aircraft carrier as it carried out drills. The incident came to light last week after U.S. officials spoke about it while lawfully operating in international waters in the South China Sea. USS Cowpens and a PLA, People's Liberation Army Navy vessel, had an encounter that required maneuvering to avoid a collision, a U.S. Pacific Fleet statement said. Okay, and friends, in our last story for tonight, it's kind of a light story. It's kind of the Bible tells us to take notice of witty inventions, and there is a U.S. company that has reinvented the wheel to make bicycles electric.
It may look like an ordinary bike, but this two-wheeler has a secret weapon. Installed on its rear hub is a new device that stores up the energy produced from pedal strokes and then releases it if the cyclist needs a push. It's been named the Copenhagen Wheel in honor of one of the world's most bike-friendly cities.
You receive it like that?
The design is the brainchild of two inventors at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The wheel contains a computer, batteries and sensors that can determine when a biker requires help. It's easy to install and allows bikes to travel up to 20 miles an hour if a rider gets tired.
Over the past few years, we've seen a cycling renaissance throughout the world. People are looking for alternatives.
The wheel also uses wireless technology to sync up with a cyclist's smartphone and can track things like the distance a person has travelled or how many calories they've burned. So far, more than 800 have been sold worldwide, and as more and more people take up cycling, reinventing the wheel may prove to be a lucrative business. Claire Brennan, BBC News.
Okay, thank you, Claire Brennan. That's on my wish list for a Copenhagen wheel. I've got a bicycle. I'm not riding it. If I had that Copenhagen wheel, save some gasoline money, that'd be terrific. Friends, thank you for joining me on this Wednesday night. That's it for tonight. God willing, and the creek don't rise. We'll be back again tomorrow evening, Thursday night, for another edition of news related to the Bible and prophecy here on Nightcast. Until next time, your host Stephen Lloyd saying, so long, friends.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilpith. Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on COGTV.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the COGTV.org video archive.